If you've been in the YouTube fitness sphere, more than likely you have encountered science bros. You know, we're science-based. Science-based. Sounds so cool. We use science because science.
Science rules.
You know, these people who only recommend you to do the things that science recommends you to do. You know, like if there's not a study on a certain movement, that means you should not do the movement. If there are multiple studies on a movement, you should do the movement. And it's like, okay, just like recently, like I've been seeing a lot of people who do the iliac pull downs, and it's like, fucking hell. Like, every single one of you is a beginner. Every single one of you. There's not a single person who is an intermediate lifter or advanced lifter who's doing this thing. Only beginners are doing this, at least from my experience. But like, I'm assuming that most people who do this, who do the iliac pull down, are beginners. Right? It's like, you are a beginner. And like, my reasoning is that as a beginner, you are way more excited to try things out. You're way more excited, you're way more likely to be just sort of integrated with the weeds. You know, you focus too much on what is not important when the basics are all you need. Like, as a beginner lifter, everything is so simple. You don't need anything. And it's like, to be honest, like, more complicating things as a beginner is actually a detriment, because you don't build a good base, and if you don't, and then from there, without that good base, you're just playing catch up the rest of the time. It's like, people who do iliac pull downs should not be doing iliac pull downs, primarily because they're beginners. And because they're beginners, they have no need to isolate their lower lat. In fact, most people never need to isolate the lower lat. Like, the lower lat is not a place of development that you need to focus on. Like, unless you're doing bodybuilding, you went to a show, and then the judges told you, you know, you could probably work on your lower lats. Like, I haven't heard a single person say that lower lats are a priority when they start off. It's like, it's only when these science bros come in and tell you, oh, you should do iliac pull-downs because they target the lower lat more. And it's like, the marketing of these content creators is towards beginners. And the information in the content, though, is not for beginners. It's like, there's a mismatch. And certainly it's marketing because beginners are the most sold to. Right? As intermediates and advanced lifters, you have your own ways. You don't need people to tell you what to do. It's only when you're a beginner, like, you receive things and it's like, oh, I should try that. I should try that. Oh, I should try that. Let's try all these things. It's only when you're a beginner that you are the most susceptible to suggestion. Hence why so many YouTube fitness channels are marketed towards beginners. Hence why V-Shred, Athlete X, succeeds so much. Because they market to beginners, because beginners truly just don't know any better. But anyway, that was my little rant on iliac pull down. If you are a lifter, if you're a beginner, you don't need to do them, and you probably shouldn't. Alright? Do your pull downs, do your regular double hand pull downs, do your pull ups. Right, like, if you can't do 5 pull ups, like clean pull ups, you have no purpose in doing iliac pull downs. Absolutely nothing, because you don't have lats. You have, like, no mass there. If you can't do 5 pull-ups, you have no mass there. Straight up. You don't have enough muscle to even be concerned with targeting a specific area of the lat. Right? But that is it for fucking iliac pull-downs. Anyway, so what's common between all of these science-based fitness channels? They're small. Small as in the creator is small. Athlete X. Mr. Jeff Cavalier. He isn't big. Now, Jeff Cavalier looks muscular and looks big because he is very lean. But leanness is an illusion. Jeff Cavalier really isn't that big. He truly does not have that much muscle. You know, it's like you train for 10 years, you'll probably have more muscle than him. Most likely. If you have like a bit like 51st percentile of muscle genetics, which is literally basically like right above average. Other people too, like Jeremy Ethier. Man, he's pretty small. If you like look at all his pictures, he's pretty small. He's not very big. He's science-based, but he's pretty small. The one outlier I know of is Jeff Nippard. And at the same time, Jeff Nippard is actually pretty short, so that's also an illusion. Right, so overall, most science-based fitness channels have people who are just small. And the thing is, you'll also be small if you continue to follow what they say, what they preach. Especially if you're a beginner. Like, personally, I don't like the fact that people follow other people's advice just because the person who's giving out advice is big. You know, just because someone's big doesn't mean that they actually know things. But on the flip side, I also really dislike those who say they know a lot, but don't have the results to back it up. It's like, there needs to be a balance. There needs to be nuance. You need to listen to the people who say things that make sense. And the thing is, there really isn't that many people who do that, unfortunately. And most of the time, people don't look at the central argument. They look at what's on the peripheral. You know, is this person big? Okay, maybe I should follow them. You know, they're big. They possibly know what they're doing. But that's ignoring like all the other factors that come into it: PEDs, genetics, etc. It's like there's factors outside of just the advice they give that influence their physique. Right. But anyway, back to small-sized, science-based channels. A big thing with these channels is that they will be proponents of exercises that show the greatest EMG activation. EMG data is basically how much a muscle is contracting based on a measurement of the electrical activity in that muscle. So basically, in studies that use EMG data, or use EMG, is they basically put electrodes on your muscles, and then when you do certain activities, it measures like the electrical activity of your muscles. And there are so many limitations to this. It's like, it's not even funny. Right? It's like there's so many limitations to EMG data that show like EMG data is not the end all be all. In fact, you probably shouldn't do exercises just because they have greater EMG activation. And I'll list them all. The first one is, it's only a measurement of muscle activity. And the limitation with measuring muscle activity is that it doesn't measure if the muscle is going to grow. Right? Like, just because you measure the fact that a muscle is being active does not mean that it's going to grow. Like, you can have a bunch of EMG data on running a lot, right? You have a lot of activation in your legs. Does that mean your muscles will grow a lot? No, it won't. Data only on muscle activation is limited because it doesn't measure if your muscle is actually going to grow. It's measuring a variable that possibly could lead to muscle growth, but it's not measuring direct muscle growth, right? So that's first limitation. Second is the location of electrodes. The thing is, you can't measure like deep muscle, right? Unless you like dig through muscles and then you put the electrode in there while you have the participant do exercises, which is going to be extremely painful, and therefore it's not going to be done. So like you can't tell the activation of muscles that are below the surface to a certain depth, right? It's like you can't tell what muscles beneath the surface are working, how much they're working or not, right? And in a similar vein, the location of the electrodes themselves, like not depth-wise, but like where on your body, also limits the measurement, right? Like there are certain parts of the quads that are activated during a leg extension, and there are certain parts that aren't as activated And it's like, if you don't put electrodes on these certain areas, you get bad data. Like, you'll get data that doesn't actually represent the muscle activity in the muscle. Right? So, like, you shouldn't trust the data. Another thing is, there's different muscle activities based on what type of movement it's undergoing. So there's the concentric movement, which is basically when the muscle contracts or shortens. So like in a bicep curl, when you curl up, that's the contraction. And then the eccentric is when you lower it down, or when your muscle is lengthening. And then there's also the isometric. Right? And the thing is, EMG data is, or the signal that you get from EMG data is the greatest with the eccentric load, when the muscle is lowering or lengthening, as compared to the concentric, whereas the muscle is shortening or contracting. A lot of studies that use EMG data don't differentiate these. And it's like Armenian deadlift has limited activation in the posterior chain as compared to an regular deadlift. Right? But, which leads to more growth? The Armenian deadlift, because it uses the weighted stretch, the lengthened negative. And that leads to more muscle damage, tissue damage, and therefore muscle growth, as compared to the straight positive only deadlift. Right? It's like, just because an exercise has more or less EMG data does not mean that it will lead to less or more growth. I just alluded to this, but there's also different EMG data based on if the muscle is lengthening or shortening. Wow, it's like, if the muscle is doing some sort of activity, the signals that the nerves send to the muscle are going to differentiate. If the muscle is lengthening, it's going to be different than the muscle shortening. Like, honestly, this is kind of just common sense if you think about it. But I mean, most people don't think about it, so it's like they see EMG data. Okay, I should do that. But no, EMG data is very flawed. Another limitation is if the load is active or passive. An active load is basically when you're actively pushing something. Right. An example of passive load is when you stretch your hamstrings. You're technically loading the hamstrings in a sense, but it's passive, right? As compared to an active load movement, which is like bench pressing, deadlifting, squatting. I'm just using the big three because pretty much everyone knows them, right? But there's definitely other movements to choose from. Speaking of loads, heavy versus lighter loads. The heavier the load is, the more EMG activation there will be. It's kind of obvious, right? It's like the heavier the load is, probably the more muscle you need to use. Therefore, the more activation of the muscles there will be, and therefore, the more EMG activation there will be. So it's it's kind of obvious if you think about it. So that's my critique of EMG data. It's there's so many flaws, there's so many nuances with EMG data. You can't just say, oh, because this study shows that this exercise has more EMG data activation, it's better. It's no, there's so many different variables to take note of, to really think about. It's no, that's not how it works. But enough of that. Something I said before was that, if science doesn't show this exercise is good, if there's no study on it, you shouldn't do it. The thing is, there's so many exercises that don't have science backing them. So many. Because the research on physical activity, on exercises, on lifting, is still very new. There aren't studies on exercises that are very niche. I mean, there's studies coming out now which are on exercises that have been done time and time again, like the overhead press. It's just now there's studies that are coming out. It's wow, the field is behind. Right? And the thing is, overall, science is pretty much always behind, because science takes a lot of time to verify things, a lot of time to make sure that the study was done right, and that the conclusions found in that study can be replicated. And if they can be replicated, then then you could say with reasonable accuracy that perhaps this is true. And that takes lots of time, because you can't just have one study that points out to something. You need to have a bunch of studies that point to the same conclusion. And because of that, science takes a lot of time. and science is usually always behind when it comes to exercise physiology. And there's simply just not enough studies yet proving what bodybuilders in the past have done before, and what that have worked for them. And that's a major limitation to science-based fitness channels, because they're limited to what the science says. They don't have any of the experience that people 100 years before now have used. They can't access that information. The vast gold mines that are in these brilliant bodybuilders, because science doesn't prove it. And if science doesn't prove it, then it can't possibly be true. It's like, that's another thing. It's like, science is another religion now. It's like, this is completely off topic, but like, science is the new religion. Christianity is dying or dead. Like, okay, Islam is growing, right? But overall, in the Western countries, scientism, the belief that science is all there is, nothing else, scientism is taking over as the new religion, with no benevolent God, just pure science. And like I said, science is limited because it takes a lot of time, and blindly believing in science does not do you any good. And I say that because I once was very zealous with science, and I tell you to not be overzealous with only listening to people who use science-based evidence, because there's a lot to be learned outside of science. Right? Science can't possibly cover everything. There's not going to be science on niche exercises because the studies aren't going to be funded. There's not going to be a science study on, let's say, a very niche exercise, the upper chest shrug. It's like, I don't think that most people have even heard of the upper chest shrug. And like, personally, I didn't until like I discovered it like pretty recently. It's like, there's something like this? It's like, huh. It's like, it's an exercise that is so niche that like nobody is gonna do a study on it because nobody cares. Like, nobody cares. So I speak to you now to not be overzealous with science, because I once was, and that became a limiting belief. My beliefs that science is everything held me back, because, well, like I said, science is always behind, and by only doing things that science approved of, I was losing out on things that would have benefited me had I not listened, and listened only and solely to science. And lastly, there are tried and true exercises, and the thing with science is that you can get a study to say anything. You can get a study to say the bench press sucks in comparison to the overhead press for chest growth. And it's like, most people would disagree with that, but like, there's probably a study out there, right? You can get a study to say anything. The thing is with these science-based channels is that most of the exercises that they say are science-backed are gimmicks. Like the Iliac pulldown, like, it's a gimmick. You don't need to do the Iliac pulldown. It's not necessary, because there are tried and true exercises that have been done for decades by bodybuilders who are bigger than you naturally, who are already bigger than you because they did these exercises and it worked for them, and you're not so much of an alien so that it doesn't work on you. It does work on you. They're tried and true exercises, and sometimes novelty is just a bitch. Sometimes novelty is truly just a bitch. Like, there's some exercises like that people come up with, and this is not just only with science-based fitness channels, but like with other channels that like targeting beginners. Like, there's this one exercise which is like holding a weight overhead with your arm extended, and then like you do like high knees, and it's like, what the fuck are you doing? It's like, huh? It's like, good God, man. Like, the things people do for content. But anyway, so many science-based fitness channels won't actually benefit you. Simply only following the science is not going to get you the results that you need. Unless you're talking about something like 100 years down the line where like there's literally been studies on every single exercise and comparing every single thing, and we have a perfect measure of muscle growth then. But until that happens, you should be wary whenever a channel says we're science-based and you should follow everything we say. You should do these exercises instead of the tried and true exercises because science says so. Because science says it's better. And just as a basic heuristic, like most science-based channels are, the people on them are small because the methods they use keep them small. And that's simply it. As much as I don't like it, there is some merit in following people who have gotten the results that you want, who are actually big. That is an end. I'll see ya.